Welcome back to our lecture 3. In this lecture, we are going to talk about the Roman world. Now, in the last lecture, we talked about the Jewish world, and of course, you need to learn about the Jewish custom and the background because Jesus was born as a Jew, and Paul and the rest of the early disciples, most of them were Jewish people. But not to forget, they were still under the Roman Empire at that time, so it is also important for us to understand a bit better about the Roman world. So for this lecture, we are going to talk about these 4 topics: life in the city, as in how would the people in a Roman city would live by, what were their entertainments, how would the facilities that they have, and then we'll talk about the social order in terms of the classification of social class in a Roman Empire, and then we talk about the social ethos. These are the beliefs that they will have as a community, though they will most likely there's no written law about how they should treat one another, but there's this imaginary or invisible law that everyone practice and abide to it. Those are the social ethos. And then finally we'll talk about the religion and philosophy in the Roman Empire during the 1st century world. So sit back and enjoy the lecture. This is a map of the Roman Empire. As you can see, it is a vast empire, huge. Take note, especially in this circle. Okay, from here you have Antioch, and then Asia Minor, Asia, and then Macedonia, Corinth will be here, and then Crete is here. And this section is very important. Why? Because of Paul's letter. Remember, if you read New Testament, you will encounter Paul's letter, and these are the areas that Paul went through for his missionary journey. Now we will come to that part in the second half of this course. But bear in mind this section, particularly the countries here, the nations under this section. Now let us first talk about the languages that people will speak in the 1st century Roman Empire. First of all, they will speak in Latina. This will be the official language they will use for any business with the government. That you need to learn to speak in Latin. If you want to talk with the governor, then you will be talking in Latin. Secondly, people still speak in Greek because of the influence of Alexander the Great. Hellenism have brought in the Koine Greek, and it becomes so influential. Even up to the time of Jesus and Paul, people still speak in Greek. That's why in our New Testament text it's still in Greek, not in Latin. In Greek. That Aramaic, because of the influence of Persian before that, and there are a lot of people still speak in Aramaic. And finally, you have Hebrew. People, the Jewish people who are pious, will still practice Hebrew. Bear in mind, the Hebrew text, the script text, the alphabet that they use for the Hebrew literature that we have in the 1st century mainly borrowed the script text from Aramaic, because people at that time do not know how to write in actual Hebrew writings, the script. So they will use the similar kind of script, which is the Aramaic script. And in fact, our modern Hebrew is using the Aramaic script. And real ancient Hebrew writing doesn't look like our Hebrew Bible today. So just bear that in mind. People in the Roman Empire would speak like these 4 languages, and probably Jesus would have known these 4, even Paul himself. Roman is famous for building very good roads. Because of this, people can travel faster and more reliable, especially for a vast empire like for Romans. In order for the army to reach to all parts of the empire in the quickest speed, then they can travel by roads. With roads, they can go to any part of the empire, especially when there was a revolt. They can go straight away in a quickest speed to reach and address the revolt. And so Rome built very good roads, roads made of stones, and they are reliable, they last long. And Christians in the first century made use of these Roman roads. If you look at Paul's missionary journey, he traveled using the main roads built by the Romans, and so this will be very helpful. And as you can see, the expansion of Christendom mainly related also to these roads. Most of the cities that Paul addressed in the New Testament, they were connected by the main roads built by Rome. Now let's talk about communication method. Just like modern days, people communicate to one another through writings of mails and letters. And so how would people in the first century record or write down their thoughts and so forth? And the first thing they might use is a wax tablet. Wax tablet basically made of wax, and you can write things on it. And when you think you want to change your writings, you can always re-wax it again. And it's very helpful for a student learning from a teacher, especially when you scribe down something about what your teacher says and so forth. However, it's not really reliable because once you heat it up, it will melt. But it's still useful for learning, for doing your maths and so forth. You can use it because you can re-wax it again. Secondly, people will use papyrus. Papyrus is basically made of the leaf of a plant, and with papyrus, it lasts longer than wax tablet, definitely. But the problem with papyrus is uneven surface, so it's not easy to write on a papyrus. And but the early church used papyrus to write down the New Testament. Okay, the letters were using papyrus. For the Jewish people, they used papyrus to write down the scroll. And so this is very, very helpful. And if you look at the picture, you can see all the letters in the papyrus. They are all actually in big capitals, and there's no space in between the words. And so that's how people in the ancient world write. They wrote in such a way, to save cost, because if you have space, then you have to make more papyrus for a kind of letter or what. So in order to save space, save cost, so they put everything together. But as a good Greek reader, you'll be able to see the words as you read the text. Next, you have the ostraka. Ostraka, basically broken piece of a pot. And for modern world, people will just throw away if your pot is, pottery is broken, you throw away. But for ancient people, they will recycle it and use it, and you can write things on it as well. And finally, you have parchment. Parchment is a kind of like a new technology where they use the skin of an animal to write. Of course, it lasts longer, but it also costs more, since you need to sacrifice, use the skin of an animal rather than like papyrus, you just get it from plant. But of course, parchment lasts longer, and the surface is smoother, it's easier to write. And here are the 4 things that people will use to write and record, and even use it to send letters and so forth. Besides good roads, Romans also built a lot of public infrastructures throughout the empire, and so I'm going to list out some of them for you to see. First, you have bathhouse, which is a common thing that people will go for bathing and for social discussion. They will go for bathhouse. It's for public, for everybody to go. Then you have gymnasium. This is, if you still remember, derived from the Greeks. Gymnasium, where the people will go there to exercise, to train their body, and also for study as a school. Then you have amphitheater. Just like the Greeks and Romans, they love for entertainment, and for Romans particularly, they will go for amphitheater for chariots races and gladiator fight, and by the time of during the persecution of Christians, they will go for the amphitheater to see Christians being persecuted, being killed, being feasted by the animal. And so can you imagine the kind of thing that it would do? And so here you can see there's a huge amphitheater. And they also built very good aqueduct. Aqueduct is a water pipe system that will allow the whole city. They basically built in the urban city to be you can transport the water to every corner of the cities, and so you do not need to build your house or your factory near the water source, because with aqueduct you can travel quite far away, and you can pipe and transport the water to your entire city without an issue. Then you have prisons. They have prisons built all over. Of course, just like today, you need prisons to separate those who have criminals from the rest of the people. And here in this picture, this is just an example of a prison in Rome, usually built after when the sewage system is no longer in use. They will use that as a prison. So it's not really like the kind of prison that you expected to see today. It's dark and smelly and musky, and of course you have not a big prison, so you have to put in many people into a small prison. Having said that, you can still do a lot of things in prison. You can still sing, as you can read in the New Testament. Paul and Silas, they sang in the prison. Okay, and finally you have agora. Agora means the marketplace. People in ancient world and also in modern world, they will go to the market to buy food, to buy things that they need. But in ancient people, they also go to the agora to talk, to debate, say philosophical ideas that you have, or you will see people arguing something about the government, about what's going on in their life, about religions and so forth. And Paul basically went to agora to preach, and because it's a place that people will gather and will listen to you. So these are some of the infrastructure that Romans will build in the empire. On the screen you can see there are two houses. On the left will be the western part of the Roman Empire. This is an example of a Roman house. They were built by bricks and concrete, and you can usually find this in the cities. So for example, in Corinth, probably houses look like this in the picture. You have a garden in the house. It's huge, and you can see if you were in a church member who are rich, you may be able to accommodate your whole church in this house. Whereas on the poorer sections, then you have house made by mud and huts. So like for example, on the right hand side of the screen, you can see those are Israelites' house built by mud and dried bricks, and you can see most of the time they will have their livestock and animals in their house. So it's not surprisingly, during the time when Jesus was born, he could not find a place to rest. I mean, the Mary cannot find a guest room to labor. So what probably happened was that the house owner let Joseph and Mary to labor or deliver the child at the lower area of the house, as you can see in the picture, where it is usually catered for the livestock and animal. So Jesus was not born in a barn, but most likely in a area where designated for the livestock of a family or for servants. Now let me talk a bit about entertainments in the first century world. There, of course, you have Olympic. Olympic is like today you have sports. This was started off way before the Romans. It was started by the Greeks and carried on in the Roman period. Then you have drama. Well, in the Greeks period, they watch tragedy, whereby you have a main character and he suffers something very bad, and the people will look at this whole tragedy and learn something out of it. However, by the time of the first century, in the Romans period, tragedy was still there, but they were also comedy. Because life was tough, they need something to laugh about, and so there were comedy as well. And drama helps to lift up the spirit of people. so that they for a moment put themselves into the world of the drama and help them to see for themselves what life is all about. And then you also have the chariots racing and gladiator. As you can see, gladiator is part of their usual game, and of course in gladiators you will see bloodshed, and it's terrible. Most of the time they will allow slaves to fight one another, or sometimes they will take prisoners to fight as gladiator. If you look at a gladiator, you will also recognize that they are all very well built, because gladiator you have to train, and sometimes in the Paul's imagery, he may use pictures like this to illustrate the life of a Christian being watched by many, like a gladiator on a stage, being watched by many people in the amphitheater. Then you have brothel. Just like today, this was a kind of like a very immoral kind of entertainment, yet it is very powerful, because brothel prostitution in ancient world is not illegal, and people take it as part of the social norm. So as you can see from the entertainment alone, the immorality of the people in the ancient world. Although there were some people who used like drama to educate the general public about ethics and morality, but generally, as you can see, Olympics is games in naked, gladiator, bloodshed, and then you have prostitution. Generally, these are very violent, bloody kind of entertainment, which Jewish people will definitely find very hard to accommodate. Now in this section we are going to talk about the social class in the Roman Empire. We're going to talk about just generally how would the social structure in a Roman Empire. Unlike our society today, in the Roman Empire, they have the upper class and the lower class. There is no middle class, not like our world today. And the classes were divided based on status and power. And for the upper class, it is actually a very small percentage of the population, roughly about maybe less than 1%. As some of the leadership gurus say that the minority is in control of the majority, and it is true. In an ancient world like Romans, this one small percent of the population have the control of the entire empire. And so for this upper class, how they manage to control the entire empire, it is through their wealth. As rich people, you can control the poor. So you supply finances to local schools, baths, temples, feasts, and games. And so the rich, like this upper class, will sit at the best place in a public seats, like you go to the amphitheater to watch a show. They will get the best place to sit, and they get to wear and dress in a certain way to show that they are higher class than the rest. And when they did something wrong, for example, they cannot be sued by the lower classes. And so that's how they enforce their power, being a upper class citizen. So let me just tell you, there are three upper classes in the Roman Empire, starting with the senators. The senators, or we call it the Ordo Senatorius, this is the highest order, and they are the richest among the three. So these are property owner, extremely rich. In the New Testament, we have two examples: Sergius Paulus, the proconsul of Cyprus, and Gallio, the proconsul of Achaia. And you can see these people are really rich. The second upper class will be the equestrians or the Ordo Equestre. As you can see, the name by itself, they are known as horse owner. During the time of the early empire, these were the generals, the soldiers owner. Now they were below the senators, yet they were still very rich. To be a equestrian, you need to accumulate wealth totaling at least 400 sesterces, or equivalent to 100,000 denarii. Okay, 400,000 sesterces equivalent to 100,000 denarii. In the New Testament, examples of equestrians like Pontius Pilate, Marcus Antonius Felix, and Porcius Festus. Now the third upper class was the decurions. These are below the equestrians. These people were the free-born aristocrats, and their wealth must be accumulated at least 100,000 sesterces. In other words, they are also very rich. Example, like Erastus in the city treasure of Corinth, and Dionysius of Athens, if you can find in your New Testament. So just a general statement here, the upper class are very rich. Okay, in order to become part of them, you need to accumulate wealth. That's as simple as it is. Of course, you need to buy yourself up, and we will talk more about that in a little while. Moving on to the lower classes. Okay, the lower classes, unlike the upper class, they have no property, wealth, power, or status, and they consist most like the 99% of the population. And so many early Christians scholars that study about the early Christians, they conclude that most likely the church in the first century will belong to the lower classes, the humilios. Okay, reason being that is the people who need the gospel the most. As you can see, they were really poor, and they need the support, and they need the gospel as a good message, good news for them. Okay, so in this lower section, there are more classes, unlike the top three. Start off with small farms and business owner. These people, the top of the worst, that's so to speak. They employ slaves to work for their farms, and sometimes they run by free men for rich patrons. Small business includes like baker, barber, butcher, innkeeper, smith, and so forth. Now, for this small business owner, if their craftsmanship is good now and they can accumulate wealth, slowly they could rise to become decurions in their community. Okay, so in ancient world, there's some form of mobility of moving up the scale. If you are good enough, then you have the plebs. The plebs are the free-born Roman citizen. These constitute about 1/3 of the population in Rome. As you can see, there are quite a big number of them, and usually become workers like fishermen, hunters, and shoemakers. And following on, you have the freedmen. Freedmen were former slaves who have been manumitted, means they buy themselves out. They free themselves by paying their master the price of their slavery. So some of them work as workers, while some start off their own business. Then you have this big group called slave in Roman Empire. Now slave, unlike today, we don't agree with slavery today, but in ancient world, slavery is a form of institutionalized social class. Okay, and they were considered as commodities in ancient. They don't see them as human beings, sad to say. They consider as an item. So some were born as slaves, while some are reduced to a slave through slave pirates, or being part of a war prison. Then you were reduced to slavery. They consist of a quarter of the entire Roman Empire. Now, what slaves would do? They would serve as workers, and some of them, because they were reduced into a slave, they were not born as slaves. They were captured as a war prison or by pirates. So some of them actually were very smart. They can be very educated. They were doctors, were slaves. Okay, so slave can even teach their masters' children, so they become educators as well. So just change the way you think about slavery in ancient world. It's not like any kind of slavery that we see in our world today. These are people who are sometimes forced to be slave. And so the last one will be the destitute. Destitutes are the lowest of the lower classes. These people are hated by people, surrounding neighbors. They if you are a holy man, you try not to touch them. In fact, these are people like orphans, widows, and people who have some form of illness, like the lepers. These are considered the outcasts, the social outcasts. And in the New Testament, we see them, especially Jesus, will touch the destitutes, which is something that normally people will definitely not do. Okay, so this is the lower class in a Roman Empire. Now, just like in the modern world, there is a certain form of social mobility in the ancient Roman Empire. So in order to move up the scale, there are things that you can do. First of all, you can marry someone from a higher class. Unfortunately, this is only for the ladies. If you are a woman, you can marry a man from a higher class. Then you can upclass yourself. Secondly, you can go to the higher class through appointment by the emperor or through the local governor. Someone appoint you to be a decorator, then you become rich automatically. Okay. Next, you may go up to the social class especially for the lower classes, through obtaining citizenship from the emperor, the senate, or the general. This is especially for foreigners who have completed their military services or who have freed themselves from slavery through that, and they can obtain citizenship. With citizenship, you automatically upgrade yourself to be, like for example, freedman in the society. Finally, you can upgrade your social class through manumission. That is, you can pay your masters the sum of money to free yourself for the slave. Well, for those who have been freed from slavery, in some sense, they are not entirely free per se, because they cannot hold public offices, nor they cannot join the equestrian. However, they can become the curators up to the point, that's all. Right? So that will be one way to go upgrade. And the children, if you have been freed from slavery, your children will be born as free citizens. And children will then not bound to this restriction for freedmen. So there's some way to upgrade your class in the Roman Empire. Many social studies have shown that early Christians community, they are generally humiliors, or the slaves. That means the lower class people. They were considered less virtuous. In fact, for the ancient people, they considered poor people as less virtuous people, because in order to survive as a poor people, you need to lie and cheat your way up the social class. So for the people in the ancient world, if you are poor, automatically they see you as someone that is unable to be honest at all times. Okay, so it is rather strange for Jesus to say, "Blessed are the poor," because for ancient people, the poor were never blessed. How can poor people be blessed? And these are the people who have to lie and cheat. How can they be blessed by God? And so that will be a social paradigm shift with the teaching of Jesus. Nevertheless, that is general depiction of the Christians in the early church. There were also some Christians who were rich, who owned property and business. Erastus is one example, and probably one of the riches in Corinth, Christians who make himself a name. Even today, if you go to Corinth, you can see the stone that marks his name, Erastus. So they were probably rich Christians as well, and if they were rich, probably they will supply and use their house as the place of worship, since the early church worshiped at home. So a big house will certainly help to cater for a church of size like 30 to 40 people. We will now talk about the family structure in the first century Romans. We will now talk about the family structure of the Roman Empire in the first century world. Okay, the first thing we want to bring attention to is the pater familias. The pater familias is the man, the oldest man, the father figure in the family. Now, in Roman's family, the power of the family is concentrated on pater familias. He holds the power, and everything in the household belongs to him. This includes the property, because only the pater familias can own properties under Romans law. And his power, the pater familias power, was unbroken until his death. Next, about marriage. Marriage under Roman rule, not everyone can have legal standing. Only certain marriage are considered to have legal protection. Okay, the requirement is this: when both partner, the groom and the bride, were Roman citizen, only then they can have a legal marriage. Otherwise, the rest of the marriage is not considered as legal. Now, not to say it's illegal per se, but they don't have the law protection. Okay, so those without legal protection, then you have your own religious law to manage your marriage. Now, the Roman law made the minimum marriage age for girls was 12 years old and boys for 14. Basically, it's the age of maturity, adulthood, where you can start produce baby. Okay. Now, for Jewish people, that would be different. Jewish girls, for the ideal age for marriage is between 12 to 18. Okay, slightly different. Reason being because Jewish people more conservative, okay. And can you imagine that was probably the age that Mary got married? The mother of Jesus, Mary, got married about this age, 12 to 18. Now let's talk about the wives in the first century Roman Empire. The historical data we have show us that an ideal wife is one who does not cheat her spouse, but put up with his affair, and who does not reject his friend, who does not leave behind his gods for foreign religion, and who does not make a public spectacle of herself, but manages his household. That is an ideal wife. Okay, so you can see here, religion for a woman is actually controlled by the husband. Therefore, when you read Book of Acts, you see that Paul had to address the issue about divorce, because for a wife converted to Judaism can lead to a serious conflict with her husband. And so you can see, because everything is under the pater familias control, even the religion. And then we talk about divorce. Divorce in earliest Roman world was rare, because only the husband can initiate divorce. That's how pathetic it was at that time, but it was true. Ancient Romans is like that. And in order to initiate divorce, he needed a very powerful reason, such as adultery. But by the time of the 1st century, this is not the case. Even wives can initiate divorce as easily as the husband. Divorce is basically a mutual consent to just break the covenant, and the courts will involve if the parties fail to agree on the terms of return of dowry and so forth. Okay, and most people, Roman people, will file for a divorce for such reason: failure to have children, for example, for political reason, or one of the party continue to have adultery, they wanted to have another person to be a wife or husband. Okay, now as for adultery, the wives rarely ask for a divorce for the adultery because they almost like take it as a norm. Okay, whereas the men will ask for it if their wife have affair. Okay, and affair with slave and lower class women were not considered as adultery by the state. So can you imagine what kind of moral law the people at the ancient world practiced with? You know, if you have affair with your slave, that is okay, no problem. Or to a certain extent, you cannot file for a legal divorce because that is not considered as adultery by the state of the government. That's how divorce was in Roman Empire. Next, we talk about parenting. Now, Seneca said this: he believed that fathers show their love for their children by imposing certain structure. They wake them up to be productive, teach them to make a living, and they don't allow the children to be idle and help them to make effort to live their life meaningfully. So that's why fathers, generally speaking, are stricter than their mother, and the father were expected to teach their children a kind of trait so that they are able to survive by themselves. With the Jewish parents, is almost the same. The fundamental obligation of Jewish parents, according to Jewish literature, was to feed and clothe their children, and the father became the provider, the discipliner, and the caretaker of the family. That's basically how generally family in ancient people functions. The parents will, the father particularly, will be the trainer, the equiper, and especially dealing with the son in the family. Okay, whereas as for the children, they have to obey their parents and show certain respect, which the Romans call it pietas. Okay, pietas is like a duty. Usually use this term to talk about the relationship between human and God. It's like human have a duty to their God. The same word is used to describe the relationship between children and the parents, whereby there's a duty to take care of their parents after they grow up. Okay, so when the parents were old and the children grew up, it is the duty of the children to provide food, clothing, and companionship as a kind of like payback to their parents when they are aging. And in a Jewish family, it's the same. In fact, as you know, very famous in Exodus chapter 20, verse 12, what the commandment God given to us is to honor your father and mother. So pietas is a crucial, important social ethos that is practiced in the family. Children will then respect their father and mother. In a similar way, Chinese also practice filial piety. Is a similar matter, even though we don't need to tell you, but the community will expect the children to take care of their parents. That's how a family in the 1st century Roman Empire functions. Now, as for the status of a woman in the ancient world, Greco-Roman culture regarded women as unable to have a high level of intellectual ability like the men did. Okay, so they have a very low perception of women, and that's how they consider women only able to take care of the family matters, childbearing, and that's all. However, by the time we reach the New Testament, the women from the upper class fought against this notion. And as you can see in the picture of the slides, there are two pictures here. The traditional woman compared with the new woman. You can see the way they dress differently and so forth. Okay, and a woman from the upper class wanted to step outside from this traditional perspective of women, and they will try their best to study, to earn, and even to become high in positions in the society. So these so-called new women, they don't stay at home. They will join clubs and society. They will come to your church and they will say they want to take leadership position. Okay, and so they will take part in even some of these cults and become leaders in the cult. So let's give you some background to the issues when Paul had to address to the church who, like for example, Corinth and the church that Timothy was leading, about women leadership. Now there's been a discussion about whether do we need to can we allow women to serve as leaders in the church. But because of the influence of new women, that's why Paul says certainly for these women who just want, for the sake of breaking their own social culture, and they try to do whatever it takes to be a leader in the church, then you shouldn't allow these people. However, we do recognize that in Paul's ministry, even in his congregation, there were a number of women who served in leadership position. So people like Lydia, Priscilla, Phoebe, Rufus, and Chloe, these were women who has leadership position in the church. So if you just say Paul is denying all sorts of women leadership, that is not correct as well. As we can see here, there were people who served in leadership positions as women. And so we can see that there is a particular issues with this group of new women that Paul probably was addressing. So if you want to interpret the text by knowing the social culture of the day, help us to see it more accurately rather than Paul banishing all sorts of women leadership. Let's talk about education. First of all, the Jewish education, how Jews would educate their children. Now, education has always been a priority in the Jewish society. And where do they start? They start at home. Okay, home was the setting for the earliest Jewish instructions, and then followed by festivals and other schools and institutions. So in every home, when they celebrate certain festival, it is also the time for them to learn. And in the festival, like for example, Passover, they will always retell those important stories about their past history. And from there, they learn about their faith. They learn about what God has been, the covenants that God had promised, and so forth. Aside from that, the father in the family would then teach the children about philosophy, physical exercise, moral, about God, about skills to trade, and of course about the Torah. So every children will be expected to learn and to be familiar with the reading and the writing of Scripture. So in other words, please do not imagine that the fishermen like Peter, they do not know how to read and write. That is certainly not the case. In Jewish family, the children were trained at least to read and write in a very early stage. Of course, there were some who go for higher level education. That is when you learn from Pharisees, you learn through following him for higher level education. But generally speaking, everyone, Jewish family would learn the simple reading, writing, and of course the message of the Torah. Now, as for the Greek education stressed discipline, or the word gymnasium, for the body, so they will have to exercise and work out, okay, and not to forget music as well, for the literature and music, for the soul, okay, learn music for the soul. And so they just don't focus on one side, not only to build up their body physically, but also their souls. Now, the most distinctive institutions of Greek cities in the New Testament era was the gymnasium. It is in this gymnasium that they practiced their skills of using javelin and so forth. So it's a training ground for them. So when Paul was talking about discipline in 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy, and he probably had in mind the gymnasium. Then in school, for the Greeks, it relies heavily upon copying and memorizing certain literature. Okay, every student go to school will have to learn and memorize stories like Homer's epic, the tragedies of Euripides, the comedies of Menander, the speeches of Demosthenes, and so forth. So what they will do is they will copy them, recite them, and memorize them. And from these stories, then they learn this culture that every Greek students will share. And everyone will be familiar with these myths or these mythological stories. And so sometimes you will see in their sayings and their writing, they will quote these stories out of nowhere, just this because it's like part of them already. So they will quote them in speech, in letters, and so forth. So as you can see, with this kind of education, Paul can assume certain things about Greek readers. When Paul was dealing with the Greeks, he would quote allusion to Menandus, Epimenides, and Aristus, without saying that, because of that, or you need to know about this, because he can assume that the Greeks know these stories pretty well because of their education system. Right? Now we talk about the Romans. How about the Romans? The Romans upper class were as well versed in Greek language and literature, and also they have to learn Latin as well. Romans education includes teaching the children about mathematics, geometry, and music. Now they don't bother so much about the philosophy. Basically, they want it to be practical. As far as these things are applicable, they will teach. They will learn about rhetoric, the art of persuasion, not really into philosophy, as long as they can make a living. So Romans, basically, the lower level education for Romans focus on the practical aspect of life. Okay, when you come to a higher education for the Romans, they will learn more about rhetoric, or the art of communication. So students will then learn the parts of well-known speech. It's like some people today, you go for speech training, you have to learn some of these parts and how to craft public speech well enough so that you show that you are a person who has been educated, because an educated person will know how to speak in a certain way. Okay, so that is why when Paul was dealing with the Corinthians, okay, he purposefully said that I don't come with the craftiness of speech, because everyone expects him to be. If you are an educated man trained through Roman school, you will be expected to be able to speak eloquently and use the right rhetoric to deal with issues. Of course, Paul knew all this. If you look at his letters, he applied this. We will come to that when we talk about Paul's letters. However, for certain reason, he said, I'm not going to use this because I want you to know that it is not through these persuasive skills in order that you gain the power. It is only through Christ. And Christ death and resurrection seems foolishness for the people, and we will talk about that when we come to the Corinthians letters. And so basically that's how Romans train the students, practical aspects and also rhetoric. So that's generally how ancient people go through their education. We will now talk about social ethos in the first century world. Now, social ethos is like an invisible kind of rules and agreement. Nobody talks about it, nobody write it down, but everybody seems to know what is going on. That is a kind of invisible rules that govern the society in the first century world. Even today, we have our own social ethos, whether we are aware of it or not. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is the concept of patrons and client. As you can see in the slides, the patron on one side and the client, and they are shaking hands, means that they are in certain relationships. Now, the patron and client is kind of invisible infrastructure that governs the giving and the receiving of benefactions. Okay, and this is how usually in the Roman society the richer one relates to maybe someone who are more needy. So it forms a kind of so-called friendship. Okay, now friend, there are many different kinds of friends in the ancient world. But this kind of particular kind of friend is that someone in need of something, and if you can provide, you can become a friend, and you become the patron, where the person receive the benefaction is called client. Okay, so the patron is usually seen as the protector of the client. The patron owes the client legal help and protection from powerful enemy. So if you take it in our context, it's something like those gangsters. You know, if you are under this taiko or this hero or this boss, then you are under his protection. Well, whoever comes and attack you, then the boss will come out and fight him. So it's a similar kind of relationship. But whenever the patron asks something back from the client, okay, maybe ask of his support or ask for his help, then the client will then have to repay and respect the patron. Okay, so usually patron will be rich people, landowner, while the clients are people who are more needy. Okay, and when the patron gives the benefictions to the client, the technical words to describe this is grace. Now, grace here is not what we thought in a religious sense, but rather it is just a word that is used to describe the giving of the patron to the client. Okay, this word is used to speak of the reciprocity among these two parties. Sometimes it's used between God and us, where God gives grace to us. Sometimes between richer people like patrons to the client, those who are needy. Okay, so grace here is used to refer to the willingness of the patron to grant benefits to another people, which is the client. Another word for this, you can call it favor. Okay, like I give you favor, I help you. So that is grace. Now, of course, grace in Greek words is also means gift. Okay, charis, gift, and many gifts use this word. Like for example, I give you this, like presents, the kind of gifts is also used as grace. So grace can have this meaning as well. And finally, when you receive grace or the gifts from someone, then you are supposed to return the grace, which is called gratitude. Okay, and that means you get a gift from your patron, you respond to her or his gift by giving another kind of gift or gratitude. So that's what Seneca says. Seneca says this: some would have it appear that there is one for bestowing a benefit, one for receiving it, and a third for returning it. Others hold that there are three classes of benefactors: those who receive benefits, those who return them, those who receive and return them at the same time. Why do the sisters hand in hand dance in a ring which returns upon itself? For the reason that a benefit passing in its course from hand to hand returns nevertheless to the giver. The beauty of the world is destroyed if the course is anywhere broken, and it has most beauty if it is continuous and maintained an uninterrupted succession. Their faces are cheerful and are ordinarily the faces of those who bestow or receive benefits. They are young because the memory of benefits ought not to grow old. They are maidens because the benefits are pure and holy and undefiled in the eyes of all. Their robes are transparent because benefits desire to be seen. Now, this is what Seneca says about this process. For Seneca, the relationship between patron and client, giving grace and giving back in gratitude, forms a kind of dance. So, by giving grace, it is the first act. Okay, the patron gives grace to the client. When the client receives the grace, then the client ought to dance back, follow the dance by returning the favor. And then patron then receive back the gifts, and then later on he gives again. So it's like a continuous dance. And so Seneca says, you break this dance, it is ugly, very, very ugly. So everybody expect, once you receive grace from someone, you will then return the grace through gratitude. Okay, and to fail to return the favor, you are in big trouble. To fail to return the favor, you break the dance and destroy this beautiful act. If you apply this to our Christian context, God is our patron and we are the client. We receive grace from God, and so we ought to then dance with this patron and client concept by returning the gratitude. Now, how do we then return gratitude? In the ancient world, in the Roman Empire, the client can return the gratitude by, number one, telling people about it. That's what patron is all about. Give you grace so that he will increase his fame and status. So you can tell your neighbors about what grace you have received from the patron. And secondly, whenever the patron needs of you, you will need to obey and accept. So if you take this context into Christian's context, same way, when we receive grace from God, we can do one thing: tell our friends and neighbor what God has done for us. By doing that, we increase the fame of God to our friends and family and relatives. Okay. The second thing that we can do is, whenever God calls us to do something, we ought to respect and submit. That is how we can show our gratitude back to our patron, who is God. So this is a kind of ethos that people in the first century, they may not talk about it, but they expect you to do so. When you receive grace from somebody, you ought to return it with gratitude. Now, the second thing I would like to talk about is purity and pollution. Okay, now this is basically talking about how someone making sense of our daily life. Okay, what can do, what I cannot do. De Silva says this: purity and pollution is actually a system that defines what is proper and improper to specific places, time, and people. In other words, what this whole concept is all about is, what can I do and what I cannot do? What is considered as proper, holy, and what is considered as improper, polluted, or sin to some extent. Okay, so Greek and Romans have a fully developed structure system to determine what is right and what is wrong, and if you do something wrong, what you need to do to rectify your wrong, your pollution. Okay, so this whole concept about purity and pollution is like You just can imagine it like a kind of disease. Okay, when you got infected with pollution, you got to do something to clear it out. And if not, pollution can be contagious. That's why sometimes in the literature, ancient literature, you see people try not to talk with certain people, or they will consider certain people as polluted. They don't even touch them. So they see pollution as a kind of something like disease that can spread through touching, through conversation, through meal together. Okay, and if you somehow accidentally touch pollution, you need to go through some form of cleansing or sacrificial ritual to get rid of it. Okay, so purity and pollution, the things that people will ask in the first century world in order to find out whether what is pure, what is polluted, is this. First, they must ask, should I do it? Is this an act that is pure, or is it an act that is polluted? Secondly, should I do it this way? Is this the right way to do it? If I do it wrongly, it may cause pollution to my body. Or third, do I do it here? Is this the right place to do certain things? Okay. Now, for example, to illustrate all these things, if you go to the Jewish temple, for example, can I go to the Jewish temple and then eat anything I like? Eat unclean food? You cannot. This is not the right place, and you should not do it. And of course, definitely not in this way. And then you go to the Jewish temple, there are different sections. If I'm a Jew, I will go to the Jewish court. If I'm a Gentile, then I cannot go into the center in the temple. I need to only remain at the Gentiles' court. This is the right place for me. So in the first century world, people constantly have to ask whether is this the right action that I can do? Should I do it this way, or should I do it even at this place? What can give pollution to us? In the first century world, they have a list of things that they consider as polluted. First of all, birth. Giving birth is considered a pollution. Someone who have went through birth cannot go to the temple, cannot go to the shrines. They have to be cleansed, and they have to wait for their confinement and so forth. And if you handle someone, you deliver a baby, you also consider as polluted as well. Secondly, death. Certainly, death is considered pollution. Touching the dead body is already considered a pollution as well. So you cannot even touch the dead body. Okay. Then third, sex. This is quite common in religious setting, especially when it comes to holy days, certain holy festival, you need to abstain from sex as well. Then you have murder, understood here, and sacrilege. That means you confine to certain things that is illegal in religious sense. For example, what Antiochus have done to the temple, that is considered as sacrilege. Finally, sickness. Some kind of sickness like leprosy, skin disease, hemorrhage, these are considered polluted sickness, and if you touch them, those who touch them also get the pollution. Now here is an example of a purity map in the first century world. First of all, if you look at the chart, let's start off with people. Some people are considered more holy than ordinary people, for example, the priests. Or if you are from a certain clan, okay, or if you are under the Davidic family, then you may be considered more important than the rest. And to a certain extent, even gender make a difference. Women are considered less holy, especially those who are having menstrual. Okay, and children that is born of an illicit union, they are considered polluted. Sometimes even up to 10 generations were barred, if you read Deuteronomy chapter 23. Now, the next one would be space. Now, certain place is considered more holy than the other places. For example, shrines and temples are considered holy places. You cannot simply go in there. And even the temple, there are different courts: the inner courts, the outer courts, the courtyard of the men, courtyard for the women. So for Jewish people particularly, the land is considered holy, and that's why they don't like foreigners to go to their land. Okay, there is space. Third is the map of time. A certain time and season are more important, are considered holy. For example, the Shabbat, Sabbath day, they are supposed to be holy day. You need to dedicate that day, cannot work, like what I have talked about. Then you have religious festival like Passover, those Day of Atonement. Those are important days that they need to separate themselves. They're not supposed to do anything but to celebrate, worship. Those are holy days. Then you have food. Especially for the Jewish people particularly, they have determined food that is clean and food that are unclean. So Jewish people will eat kosher food, which is clean food, and they will stay away from unclean food. And finally, the map of body. This talk about things that in your physical body. For example, corpse, a dead body is considered polluted. You cannot touch. You should not touch dead body. If you have touched the dead body, you need to go through the cleansing ritual, or certain form of sickness. For example, leprosy, you consider polluted. And finally, sexual or menstruation is considered pollution as well. Even the nocturnal emission and sexual intercourse is considered pollution. Okay, so in conclusion, in this map, we can see in ancient world you cannot simply do anything. Everyone have to observe the purity map. And if you violate any of this, you need to deal with your pollution. And now we're going to talk about how to deal with pollution. Now, how do we deal with pollution? There's few ways. First of all, you go through atonement. Okay, for the Jews, they will do the sacrifice to atone for their sin, pollution. Secondly, you can go through water cleansing ritual. And this kind of cleansing ritual is not only for the Jews, but also in the Greco-Roman religions. They have cleansing ritual to clean away the pollution. And finally, through punishment. Sometimes, especially for the Greco-Romans, even Jewish people, if you do something wrong, you will be punished as a kind of retribution to your pollution. So that's how ancient people deal with pollution. Next, we are talking about the honor and shame in ancient culture. Here in the slide, you can see honor and shame is an individual or a group sense of worth. This is a system that promotes or punishes. It's an invisible structure whereby the discipline teacher is there to make sure you behave. Okay, and this is very, very fundamental for the first century culture. And through this, people get promoted or they get demoted. And Seneca says this. He says, and I quote, "The one firm conviction from which we move to the proof of other points is this: that which is honorable is held dear for no other reason than because it is honorable." And that is the quotation. That means sometimes you do something desperately, not because you want more money or whatsoever, but just because it is honorable. And so, the idea of honor in ancient world is really a big thing. It's not like today you don't bother what is honor. For ancient culture, honor is a very important concept. It is a dynamic and relational concept. Okay? While the powerful and the mass and the philosophers and the Jew, pagan or Christians, they all regarded honor and dishonor in certain way. Okay? That means they will celebrate when you do something and they will punish you if you do something wrong. So everyone in an ancient world have certain form of this practice. And more importantly here is this. Honor and shame is not a concept for an individual sense only, but it involves the whole group. That means sometimes if you do something wrong, you bring shame not just to yourself, but it also brings shame to the entire community. Alright, so for example, the church in Corinth, one of them have adultery. So if you look at it from an honor and shame perspective, that person's wrong is not only pertaining to his sense of honor, but the whole church is facing the same kind of shame. The problem in that context, however, the people don't feel shameful. That is why Paul have to address it and tell them what is wrong with you guys. Okay, so every religion, every social ethnic group or class or club in ancient world have a set of structure that govern their honor and shame. What they will celebrate, what will they consider as good, they will promote, or what we will consider as bad, they will use shame to make sure it will not happen again. Now, in order to have honor in life, there are a few ways to achieve. The first one will be ascribed. That means you're born with it. Okay, if you're born as in a very rich family, in a Davidic family, you automatically have certain level of honor in life. Or if you're born as a male, you will be more considered as more honorable than if you are born in a female. Or you're born in a certain race. For the Jews, if you're born as a Jew, or you're considered as the elected people of God straight away. So this kind of honor is considered as ascribed. You're born with it. The other kind of honor, you can actually achieve it. Okay, if you don't have, you may be born as a slave, but you continually to work out in your life, you try to build a name for yourself. You can also achieve honors through building reputation. Okay, how do we then build reputation? Oh, there are many ways. You can win a social game, for example. You make a name for yourself, or you help the cities to build roads. That's a way to achieve honor. Or you become a patron to a community. You provide food. You provide clothes. That's another way to achieve honor. Okay, and so honor is a very, very important element. People will do everything to get honor in ancient world, and that's why this gives you a reason. Sometimes people may want to be the leader in a certain community or even in a church just to get honor. Okay, so this is rather a kind of different concept from today, but it is really an important concept in the first century world. Now, aside from honor, we'll talk about kinship. Kinship is kind of relationship that talks about who do you belong to. Okay, and this is what David, author de Silva, says about kinship. People who are kin thought of themselves as also being kind, in the sense of being of the same sort or being liked, as in a kindred spirit. These close bonds of connectedness were established by nature itself, where they drew the line between kin and non-kin, between us and who are alike and them that are not like us. Could vary from situation to situation. In other words, kinship is really like a gang kind of relationship. If you consider yourself as a gang, that means you mark yourself different from the outsiders. We have our own family members, though they may not be necessarily have a family in a blood relationship. That means I'm a real brother or a real mother of some sort. But as long as we are within this clan or we are within this group, then we can consider ourselves as a kin. We are in the same sort in a certain way. For example, Jesus considered those who believe him as his own kin. Who are my family members? He's not talking about his real blood brothers and mothers and all. He said that whoever does the will of God, he or she is my family members. He or she is my brothers and sisters. And that's how he defined his kinship. Okay, so it varies from situation to situation, and kinship has their own kin ethos. Okay, we will talk about kinship ethos now. Okay, within a kin, there are certain unspoken rules that you need to abide with. First of all, you learn to cooperate. You don't compete within your kin. In Greco-Romans and Jewish environment, most of the time they were competitive because everyone tried to climb the ladder to go up the social scale. Right? I mentioned that before. And so most of the time they will compete with one another. But if you're within the same kin, you don't compete with one another, but you compete with those from outsiders, from another kin, from a rival family. Okay, those people you compete with. Within the kin, we try to protect one another, we try to help one another, we cooperate so that we can become stronger, and then we can win the outsiders. Okay, we can compete then with the outsiders. Secondly, within the kin, we learn to trust. A kin consider themselves as like a family. And so within a family, there must be trust. And this trust is only within this kin. They may not trust people from outside, but they will learn to trust one another. Third, harmony. Within a kin, we must have harmony. We share ideas, we share possessions, we don't fight. And so we have to be in one mind, one light, harmony as a family, united as a body. That's why if you read the New Testament, you'll find this kind of language of kinship is quite prominent in Paul's literature, and also in the teaching of Jesus that the church must be one. That is the idea of kinship. The church must be harmony. Okay, then moving on, the fourth ethos is hiding the shame of a kin. Now, this is something a bit sensitive here, but I guess you will understand the meaning. If something bad happened within your kin, there is someone did something wrong, and it be, of course, something that is shameful to the community, rather than laughing at the person, rather than exposing the person, what the kin will do is to hide the shame, because his dishonor is not only for him, his dishonor is for the whole kin. That's why in ancient kinship ethos, they will not publicize. They will try to keep it close, keep it within your family, and you will deal with issues within the family. So they will have their own family kin's law to govern their own kin. Okay, and finally, within the kin, they will practice forgiveness, reconciliation, and patience. This is attested in the ancient moralists, who says that within the kin we need to continuously practice this forgiveness, reconciliation, and patience as we seek to bear in one another so that we can achieve harmony. Okay, and this is a very important thing that we need to do if we want to continue to remain in the kin. Now, after listening to these 5 ethos of kinship, do you see actually the church in a very similar way practice these 5 kinship ethos within our community? Of course, we don't say because we want to hide the shame of a kin, then we don't expose him for his sin or her sin. But nonetheless, even if we deal with the sin of the person, we don't simply shame the person in front of the public. Whereas we try to deal with the issue within our own community. So in a church, in a similar way, we need to practice cooperation. We need to learn how to trust one another. We need to have harmony in the church. We need to, in some sense, hide the shame of our own kin within our own community. And we need to learn forgiveness, reconciliation, and patience. The last thing I would like to talk about in this section is immorality in the first century world. If you read the New Testament letter, you will see that Paul keep on talking about the sins that you need to get rid of among, especially to the Gentiles. This is because immorality is prevalent in the society then. And sometimes even the pagan gods and goddesses, they celebrate these immoral acts. And first thing I want to talk about is prostitution. In the first century world, prostitution is not just by women, but also by men. Both men and women can become prostitutes, and it was a well-recognized institution. Sometimes slave girls often fell victim to this kind of problem, and in order to gain money, some men even prostitute their own wives and children. And then we talk about homosexual. Now, even in the Roman Empire, they don't recognize homosexual kind of marriage per se. Okay, they cannot get any legal binding, legal protection if they are homosexual partners. However, they do accept them as part of their entertainment and relationship. It's like a kind of an illegal kind of relationship, but it is acceptable. In an excavation at Pompeii, the famous city of Pompeii, shows that there are obscene pictures and carving on the wall of the house showing homosexual relationship. And not to forget pornographic mural, like I mentioned in Pompeii. If you go to the brothel house, you will see on the wall there will be all these pornographic pictures. Divorce and murder were common in the first century, in view of like they give reasons that you cannot have children, you can get divorced, or if you give birth to a daughter, you can get divorced. And that is why it is really hard to remain faithful to one wife or one husband. So if you see Jesus have a very high demand for marriage in view of this immoral culture at that time. Now, exposing children is kind of like a very scary practice, because Gentile parents, as when they have children or give birth to a daughter, infant daughter, they might expose that daughter on the street. That is, they dump there at the city forum or the hillside or the alley, because they consider son as more precious than daughter. That's how sad it was. And sometimes when those daughters that were dumped on the street, they were picked up by the prostitute, and later they then turn into prostitute themselves. Okay, in fact, we found a letter in the Oxyrhynchus Papyrus says this. It is a letter from a husband to a wife. It says this: if by chance you bear a child, if it's a male, let him live. If it's a female, throw it out. That is the kind of culture that the first century will live by. They prefer male over female, and they will expose the girls. So sad. And finally, sexual and violent entertainment. During this period of time, sometimes sexual acts is shown as part of a drama on stage, and being, like for example, gladiator shows. They are violent, bloody, and most of the time end with death. Then animal fighting with human, and sometimes they use Christians as part of the entertainment. bringing in beasts and the Christians and show it as like a show for the people. So that is the kind of entertainment people will go and watch for enjoyment. So if you imagine all these immoral activities were ongoing, can you imagine what kind of people that will give, what kind of culture that will birth out of this kind of immorality acts? Okay, so that is the kind of world that in the first century. Having said all this immorality, please don't think that there's no hope in the first century. Despite this immoral kind of culture, there were people who are considered holy and righteous. There were people who uphold good morality and virtue. So not everyone is immoral. However, that being said, many people on the street particularly, they will have no problem accepting these immoral activities in their daily lives. We will now give you the overview of the Greeks and Romans religions and philosophy. Starting off with Greek religion. What can we learn about Greek religion? Well, about the Greek gods, first of all, they're anthropomorphic. That means they are like human beings. Okay, the Greek gods have anger, they were jealous, they're like human, like any other human. But of course, they are superhuman. Okay, of course, and then they are immortals, they won't die. They worship, the Greek worship gods as a kind of transaction. I bless you, I give you this offering, please bless me in return. So when people worship gods, for the Greeks, it's a kind of transaction. And for the Greeks, the gods is the keeper of morality. Although sometimes the god will fight among themselves, but most of the time they look up to them as a kind of standard for their morality. Each of these Greek gods have different functions, and we will see in the next slide about all these different Greek gods. And for the Greeks, the gods stay at Mount Olympus, which is actually not far away from them, okay, but it's a mountain, and this is where the immortals will stay. I will now give you an overview of all the Greek gods, and of course I will also give you the Romans counterpart. You will see that they have different names. Reason being, the Romans accept the Greek gods and they don't want to compete. There's no point competing anyway. So I'm not giving you the details of each of these gods. Reason being, you can just Google them. You can find all the information online. So let's start with Zeus, and the counterpart for Romans will be Jupiter. Zeus is the father of gods and men, and he is also the god of the sky and weather. Then his wife, Hera, is the goddess of marriage and woman. Poseidon is the brother of Zeus, god of sea, water, and earthquakes. Then Apollo is the son of Zeus. Apollo is known as the ideal Greek boy because he is handsome, beautiful, and good with music, archery, prophecy, medicine, and so forth. And later on, he is also known as god of the sun. There was a very popular temple in Delphi, the temple of Apollo, during the time of Paul. Next, we'll have Artemis. As you can see in the picture, Artemis has many breasts. She is the twin sister of Apollo. She's the goddess of the countryside, the wild animals, and she presided over childbirth. That explains why the many breasts. Okay. The temple of Artemis in Ephesus was one of the 7 wonders of the world back then. Then we have Athena. Athena is the defender of Athens, so you see the javelin there, and she is also the virgin goddess of wisdom, fine and skilled arts. And Hermes is the half brother of Apollo. He is known for his cleverness and a messenger who prepares the way for gods. Now Paul identified with this guy Hermes in Acts chapter 14 verse 12. Next we have Ares. Ares is the god of war. And Aphrodite is the goddess of love, beauty, and fertility. She is also the mother of Eros. As you can see that in the picture, trying to cover up. And then you have Demeter, is the goddess of grain. Dionysus or Bacchus, more well known as Bacchus, as the god of wine. And finally, we have the Hephaestus, the god of fire and crafts. Now, the temple of Hephaestus in the 5th BCE in Athens is one of the best preserved Greek temples that we have today. Now, this is just the basic samples of it. For more information, go and Google them up. Now, as for Roman religion, the way Roman worship God is slightly different from Greeks. Okay, not exactly different, but slightly different. Okay, so Roman gods, first of all, fusion with the Greeks. Like I said, they have a counterparts, almost the same. They just have different name. Okay, and for the Romans, when they worship God, unlike the Greeks who worship as a transaction, they consider that as pax deorum. That means making peace with God. So they were so fearful of their God. So when they offer sacrifice, they tell their God, please don't come and disturb me. Make peace with you. So if something bad happened to their life, they may be thinking that God is the wrath of the God is upon them, or the God is making them suffer. So they have to make peace with God. And remember the word pietas I mentioned about the relationship between children and father, and as well as human and God. So when Romans worship God, it's not just a matter of making peace, but it's an obligation. For the Romans, they call religio, which is the feeling of awe in the presence of the divine. And so the feeling of uneasiness, if anything in the sphere of pietas was not performed, that's religio. So if they forget to make the sacrifice to their God today, they feel religio, kind of feeling, oh no, that's why something bad happened to me. So they will offer their sacrifice to the God to receive pax deorum, to make peace with God. And for the Romans, unlike Greek, worship is not in individual matters per se, but it becomes more cooperative, whereby there will be priests to guide and do the matters of worship. So religion then is then institutionalized and become matters for the expert. Finally, religion for Romans is like a legal kind of relationship. The relationship between God and the worshippers are actually based on contract, so that is how Romans consider their religion and their gods. Now, those gods and religion that I mentioned earlier, those descriptions, they are mainly the general kind of religion. However, for some people, this kind of religion, they are not satisfying. Some people long for more exotic kind of relationship, more intimate kind of relationship. And so, new cults emerge after the 3rd century BCE, and some of these religion, we call it mystery religion, give a kind of more experience to the believers. Okay, so mysterious religion promise a kind of personal communion with the divine, and usually they have secret initiation event. For example, they have this union with the deity, obtain salvation, and promise bliss in the afterlife. And most of the time, these are done in secret. Okay, if you want to join them, you need to find out where the secret rites were, and you need to go through it. So, as you can see, people who are not satisfied with the general religion, they will go and experience some of this. Give you some examples here. For example, Demeter. The cult of Demeter perhaps is one of the oldest Greek mystery religion. In the myth, the god of the underworld kidnapped Persephone, the daughter of Demeter. Now, Demeter was actually the goddess of the soil. Now, Demeter's absence in pursuit of these underworld kidnappers caused the vegetation to stop growing. And so, to prevent all humans from dying, so Zeus allowed Demeter and Persephone to be reunited each year for a short time. So this gives you the reason why the crops will grow at certain period of time annually. So that's for them to explain the growth cycle, plant growth cycle. Now the rites connected to this cult, which is called the Eleusinian Mysteries, which is held each year in Eleusis near Athens. Another example would be Isis. The cult of Isis originated from Egypt, but spread through the empire, Roman Empire, and by spreading through, they changed based on time. Okay. Now Ptolemy changed this religion in order to bring together Egyptian and Greek belief, and he replaced the Osiris with a new god Seraphis. Now, this religion elaborates ritual and emphasizes on human immortality, thus making this religion very popular. Because everybody wants to live longer, so they try to worship this and practice whatever is given in this cult. Another example is Cybele. The cult of this cult is actually talking about the Great Mother or the Corn Mother, Cybele, and it was very popular in the Mediterranean during the New Testament time. Now, Cybele was starting as a nature goddess in Phrygia. She came to be seen as the mother goddess to all gods. The cult's central myth thought that Cybele drives insane her human lover, Attis, when he became unfaithful to her. So when Attis castrates himself and later dies, Cybele goes into mourning and so introduces death into the world. But she then preserves Attis' body from decaying and life is restored to nature. What is more significant or more interesting is this, the Tribolium rite. It's actually a bull sacrifice rite. This ritual is supposed to mean that it initiates the lay underneath boards on which a bull was sacrificed. So when you sacrifice a bull, you put a board underneath, catching the blood, and then you use the blood to sprinkle your face. That is how the ritual, very bloody ritual, that's what it's famous for. And then we have Mithra. The cult of Mithra is described as the god of Mithra springing to life from a rock, battling the sun and then slaying a bull, and an act represented the first act of creation. Okay, so this is the very popular cult, one of the most popular, and is helping souls to reunite with the good God. Okay, because they consider the world is dualistic, means if there's good, there's bad. Okay, so Mithraism saw humans as trapped in between this struggle between good and evil. And so the soul of human on earth was 7 levels removed from the original home in heaven and contaminated with the contact with the body. So the soul that passes the test of this life will eventually reunite with the good God. So Mithra is trying to help people to go through these 7 steps and you finally reach the good God. And Mithraism became the most important mystery religion in the empire, to the point of rivaling the popularity of Christianity for a time. So to know more about each of these, you may want to go and Google them out. Finally, I would like to introduce you to the imperial cult. Okay, imperial cult, emperor worship was a way for the Romans to establish its power in the Eastern Mediterranean. Okay, then oaths were sworn by the name of emperor. So why do they want to do this? Because you know the empire becomes so big. So in order to enforce the loyalty of the people towards the emperor, they use religion. And so they have this imperial cult, the worship of the emperor. So for example, Nero, they want people to consider him as Lord, the title Lord. Okay, usually Lord, you don't call anyone Lord, you only call God as Lord. So Nero says, call me Lord. You use the title Lord to refer to him. Another example would be Vespasian and his son Titus were called Savior. Okay, and the most famous one, of course, is Domitian, who demanded even his own fellow Romans to address him as Lord God. So the Roman did not require anyone to worship only the emperor. They allowed the people to retain their own religious worship, but you add on to it by worshipping me as additional. Of course, the Jews cannot worship the emperor, because worshipping the emperor is a violation to their belief of one God. So the Romans then give them special permission. Okay, don't worry, you don't need to worship the imperial cult, don't need to worship the emperor, but you offer sacrifice on behalf of the emperor. Okay, you offer sacrifice. So in the first century, the high priest will offer sacrifice for the emperor to God. Finally, we come to philosophy. Philosophy in the Hellenistic and Roman period was not like a kind of critical discipline for learning like theoretical learning in our modern day philosophy, but it is more like a way of life. Okay, so philosophy is actually a way of life for them. It's a matter of life and death. It's not just something for you to think about. And some even consider philosophy like a religion, especially for those who are educated ones. And philosophy helps to determine what is right and wrong, how they come up with their social ethos and their ethics finally. For example, Aristotle had a whole book on ethics. What is right, what is wrong, how do you see the logic of life? So if you see, philosophy in the ancient world is not just a subject to study, it is a worldview for an individual, and it provides the way of living to some extent. Now I'm going to show you some of the philosophical trend in the first century, but I'm not going to tell everything because there are more than what is shown in this slide. What you need to do is to Google some of that, and in the workbook I have also listed some other philosophical trend you need to study and find out more about each one of them, as they may serve as background to some of Paul's argument and even to some extent the early church discussion about theology. One of the famous one is Platonism. Now Plato was a student of Socrates, and he has this idea or this understanding about the world, that what we see now in this world, the current world, is just a shadow of what is a real world in another reality. Okay, so for Plato, in order to fulfill our destiny on earth, on this world, we need to find a way to escape this material world and to go to the other reality, that is the home where we need to be. That is Platonism. Next we have Cynics. Cynics is another disciple of Socrates, but he disagreed with Plato. He didn't really believe what he said, what Plato said, and he has no interest about God. Cynics have interest about nature, life, trying to find meaning in life. And so he will ask questions that are difficult to understand, and where in a very simplified way, and always engage with dialogues that is full of questions, paradox. That is Cynics. Next, we have Epicureans. Epicureans is another philosophical traditions, and in English, we call Epicure as someone who is devoted to sensual pleasure, food, and wine. But in ancient understanding of Epicureans is more than that. Epicurus himself was actually a kind of virtuous and decent man. But he doesn't believe in myth and abstraction. What he says, why you make all these stories so difficult? For him, he trusts his feeling, he trusts his own senses. So he designed this philosophy is to free people from fears and superstitions. So for him, why do you need religion? That's what he will ask. Well, what is more important is that what I can feel today, what I can do. That's why later on people consider Epicureans as some sort of like a debauchery, because they always talk about food and enjoyment. But for Epicureans, the main thing is this: why we need to talk about religion? God has nothing to do with human existence. Death is final. There's no resurrection. So enjoy your life while you're still here. That is Epicureans. Next, we have Stoic. Stoic was actually a contemporary of Epicurus, the founder of Epicureans. Stoic's founder is Cypriot Zeno. He lectured in a colonnade porch at Athens and trained by a cynic. Okay, so Stoics have this belief regarding the universe as a single organism energized by a world soul, or the Logos, the divine reason that guides all things. That is Stoics. Say the whole universe is a single organism. Then behind all this, there's a divine reason, a Logos, that control or guides all things. So there is no separate world of ideas like what Plato says, because Plato have this current world and another world, but for Stoics it's one world. And as part of the universe, if people live according to the guide reasons or the natural law, they can remain peaceful, tranquil in the face of adversity. Affections and passions are looked on as just pathological states from which people could be delivered. So that's why you see Stoic, they don't laugh, they don't feel what, they just look stoic. That's where the English word comes, they look stoic. Okay, so this system of thought concentrate on moral value and the conquest of oneself. Yet the emphasis on divine reasons, almost monotheistic in tone, accommodated diverse mythologies as the gods became symbols of the government of nature. As you can hear, many Christians then sounds like Stoics, because talk about morality, about conquest of our own self, beating my own body. This sounds like Stoic. In fact, some scholars consider Paul borrowed a lot of Stoics' idea in his writing. And then we have another guy by the name Philo. Now Philo, as I introduced you before in the second lecture on Jewish world, Philo came from a very wealthy Hellenized Jewish family of Alexandria, and he learned Greek philosophy, poetry, drama, and so forth. What he's famous for is that he synchronized his Greek philosophy with biblical principle. And from there, he came up with this allegorical interpretation of the Bible. So, here is an example of a person living in the Middle East, yet very familiar with Greek philosophy. That's just show you why you need to study philosophical trend, because they do influence the authors and the writers in the Eastern world, even Paul probably. And finally, Gnosticism. Now, the origin of this group of Gnostics are disputed. Okay, and most scholars consider the Gnostics, full-blown Gnostics, were later part of history. That means they probably arise in the 2nd century, but even in the 1st century there were some form of Gnostic beliefs in the empire. Okay, what Gnostic belief is this? that they consider human souls or spiritual principles do not belong to this material world. Gnostic will consider this world as evil and ignorant. So in order to be saved, they can only be saved through receiving the secret or the special revelation. That's where the Gnostics knowledge comes in. By receiving this revelation that they belong in a heavenly realm, where there is a hierarchy of emanation from this true God. Now, in order to go and ascend to this new heavenly realm, one have to go through baptism, some ritual, and then some kind of philosophical reflection. That's why I put Gnosticism under philosophical trend, because they emphasize on knowledge and philosophical reflection. And some Gnostic groups had even their own hierarchy and virtually constitute a counter church. And one of the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library reveals a lot of Gnostic gospel that is trying to be a rival to our gospel by portraying a very different Jesus. That is Gnosticism. Alright, we have come to the end of our third lecture. So here is a simple wrap up of what we have studied thus far. The world of the New Testament has both Jewish and Greco-Roman influences. As you can see in this set of lecture, you will know that the philosophical, the social ethos, the way they worship gods, all this have influenced the New Testament's author. So you cannot study the New Testament just based on Jewish world alone, but you also need to see through from the Greco-Roman's lens. Secondly, understanding the political system, social ethos, religions, and philosophy will help us to see the New Testament in its own context. Particularly important is when we study Paul's epistles. By understanding all this Greco-Roman's world, we will be able to interpret this more Paul's literature more accurately. Finally, the New Testament world is not so different from ours. The early Christians faced the same problem like what we face today. They face the problem with the government, religious fanatics, social and cultural immorality, just like our world today. Don't think that only the world today know how to sin. The world in the Paul's time, they were equally sinful. Nothing has changed much when it comes to the sinfulness of humanity. And so from there we can see what happens then can also be applied to what happens to us today. And so from this lecture, I hope that you learn a bit more about the Roman Empire and the Greco-Roman's culture, belief system, and so forth. And hope that from these things that you learn, it becomes a lens for you to interpret the New Testament in a better light, in a more accurate manner. So see you in the next lecture.